Now, I asked Glenn to send me his vita so I could introduce him, and as well as, what year did you come to Penn State, etc. And I discovered, Glenn, that you came here in 1991. So if you stay an extra year, you would be here in even 30 years. But instead, you're going out in 29 years. So just a little background on Glenn. He has a BA in philosophy that he got in 1972 from Harper College at SUNY Binghamton. And I guess this is probably no surprise to the rest of you, but it was to me, is that he was the valedictorian of his class. So Glenn did both his master's and PhD at Yale University, and his advisor, Ed Casey, I don't know if he's here at the moment, but he's coming to this talk today. So that's wonderful. So I'll mention him again at the end of my introduction. So Glenn is well known and well loved on this campus. And I just want to tell you a little story about how I first met him. And I came to the university in 2002. And my book about the intersection of spirituality and culture based on a research study had just come out, and I was giving a talk on campus, and Glenn came to the talk. Now, mind you, this is this is almost 20 years ago, so spirituality in higher education is controversial enough now. But imagine what it was like then. And he kept telling me I should be more bold, and I shouldn't be so subtle about it. So I'm like, who is this guy? Little did I know he would become one of my best friends on this campus. So that was back in 2003 or 2002. Glenn was promoted to full professor in 2003, and he was eventually promoted to distinguished professor of philosophy and humanities in 2018. He's had many, many roles on this campus. He won the Research Award in 1994, and then he won it again in 2009. He's been the Faculty Senate President at least twice that I know of. I should send you a sympathy card for that. He has been the chair of the College Promotion and Tenure Committee at least once that I know of, and probably more often than that. From the standpoint of publications, he's published 5 books of philosophy and 2 books of poetry, and a really delightful presentation Glenn gave a couple of years ago now was a presentation on his poetry, where you really got to know the inner life of Glenn Mazis. So some of his scholarly publications, some of his scholarly books, he's extremely well known in the world for being one of probably the world's foremost scholars on the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty. So his 2017 book was Merleau-Ponty in the Face of the World: Silence, Ethics, Imagination, and Poetic Ontology. In 2008, he did Humans, Animals, Machines, and Blurring Boundaries. He did Earth Bodies, Rediscovering Our Planetary Senses in 2002. So Glenn has not only been an extremely active scholar himself, but he's been extremely active in mentoring the scholars, our own scholars. He has been on many of the doctoral committees in adult education and lifelong learning, particularly those that have anything to do with embodied learning. And Glenn has converted all such students to being followers of Merleau-Ponty. And I see some of them here, Jennifer Tobin, Philomena Bamer, and some others. But Glenn is also a great servant. He's been a great servant to the university and to the community. Such a great servant. I already mentioned the fact that he has been the president of the promotion and tenure, the president of the Faculty Senate twice. He got the Service Award this year. He's been on many very high-profile search committees, but he's also been a great servant to the community and the world. He's been elected twice to the Marietta Borough Council. He's been a member for 4.5 years and is the Borough Council president for the last 2.5 years. He got the borough a $450,000 grant from the Department of Community and Economic Development for the construction of flapper valves on outflows to the river to stop repeated flooding. I often see Glenn pictured with the governor, and I'm like, what is this high profile connection that you have with the governor? And he said it's because they have this common interest in flood mitigation, and that Governor Wolf himself grew up in a river town. So, so all that said, Ed Casey, if you are here, we are delighted that you mentored Dr. Glenn Mazis so well. He's an incredible scholar, servant, and friend, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Glenn Mazis today, doing his last lecture on one of his favorite subjects, why be a body? So with that, I give you over to my good friend, Glenn Mazis.
Oh, Libby, thank you so much. What an introduction. It's hard to make me blush. I am blushing. Fortunately, it's hard to see on Zoom, although I do look a little red to myself. So a couple things. First of all, philosophers, and Ed is here. Ed Casey's here. Thank you. And I'm going to call on him when I'm done with my lecture. Thank you, Ed, for making time. But you know, I've been doing, I don't know, I've probably done at least 75, maybe 100 philosophy presentations, and philosophers tend to read their papers at lightning speed so they can get in every arcane concept possible and make every argument possible. And I'm not going to do that today. I just want to have an informal talk about some of the things that, you know, have meant a lot to me over the years. I'm going to throw out a lot of ideas in a very down-to-earth way, and I'm not going to make big arguments for them, and I'm not going to use a lot of jargon. And what I want to do is not talk for more than a half hour, so because my entire 43 years of teaching, I've always taught in a Socratic way, and I've always, to me, the whole fun of philosophy is talking with people. So, you know, I want to at least leave Libby's introduction really took away some time. I want to at least leave 20 minutes of the hour for you to ask questions or have responses or have a discussion. Okay. And one or two other prefatory notes. I want to dedicate today's gathering to two people, Bill Mahar, who was my dear, dear friend, and I'm choking up, and a wonderful supporter. He was, you know, my chair for a good time, for at least for half of my time here. And he gave his heart to Penn State Harrisburg, and he's still dearly missed. And I want to dedicate this to Bill. And the second person I want to dedicate it to, and actually a lot of you got to meet her over the years, is my mom, because my mom would come to classes like at least once a year. And so she got to know a lot of people on campus. And, you know, she was this courageous woman who raised me as a single mom when that was not very common, unlike today, unfortunately, where it's very common. And she loved learning. And if there's any reason why I'm a philosopher, it's because of my mom. So I want to dedicate that to both of them. I also, you know, seeing all these people out here wants to make, I'm getting choked up also, from teachers to colleagues to students to friends to family to members of the community. You know, I've been a very lucky person, had a wonderful career, and there's been so much support from this community. And students, faculty, administrators, the students have been wonderful. I have so many amazing memories of how they've discovered new dimensions to their lives. And since Ed is on the line now, I want to thank Ed. You know, he's, you know, probably the most prominent phenomenologist, and I'm going to explain phenomenology in a minute. And, I was so fortunate at Yale to be able to study with him and to always keep him as a mentor and somebody with whom I could have a dialogue. Okay, so now I'm going to start. So here we go. But I'm going to start in an unusual way, which is to give a little biographical background to what I'm about to say. So when I was around 7 years old, I had this weird feeling like not everybody was here, that actually maybe a lot of people weren't really here. I mean, they were here in physical space, but they didn't seem to be really present. Um, and this is what Martin Heidegger, who I later studied in college very assiduously, what Martin Heidegger said. He said the Holocaust might happen and no one would notice. And that's exactly what he meant. That nobody's really here interacting, paying attention, being transformed by other people, that we're all just going through the motions. So I thought about that when I was a kid, but it wasn't until I was 12 or 13 and I read Thornton Wilder's play, Our Town. And I actually looked this up today because I wanted to read you a few lines. So in Thornton Wilder's play, it's about Grover's Corners, which is this little town in New England, and everyone's going about their business. And, in a very average American way. And I won't even say more about the play, but then part of the play, the people are in the cemetery above the town, looking down on the town. And in the beginning of the third act, Emily, who's one of the characters in the play, who dies young, she arrives at the cemetery, and the people who are dead start having a conversation. And she says to Mrs. Gibbs, who's been dead for quite a while, and they're looking down on the town, and they're looking at the funeral that's been gathered for Emily. And Emily says, live people don't understand, do they? And Mrs. Gibbs says, no, dear, not very much. And Emily says, they're sort of shut up in little boxes, aren't they? This is the dead person looking at the living people. And then she looks at them, and she's looking at her husband, and she's looking at all of her friends, and she said, oh, Mother Gibbs, I never realized before how troubled and how in the dark live persons are. Look at him, I love him so. But yet they're all troubled. And then Thornton Wilder does this thing where if you've just died, or actually any of the dead people, could choose to go back and relive a day of their life, but all the other dead people are too wise to do that now. But Emily wants to give it a try. So Emily goes back and she relives a day of her life. And she goes back and she says in the middle of this day to her mother, oh, Mama, just look at me 1 minute, as though you really saw me. And then she goes back to the cemetery and realizes that living people just don't have the time to really realize that they're alive. And she says, I didn't realize. So this was all going on and we never noticed. Well, after I read Our Town, I thought, okay, Mazis, Glenn, you're not crazy. Other people have noticed the same thing. And so that's why I became a philosopher. I became a philosopher to find out what caused that lack of spontaneity, that lack of expressiveness, that lack of appreciation for the wonder of being alive. What was the cause of the isolation of so many people and the frustration that there wasn't more to life? And, what was the cause that they thought that the secret was in some other realm beyond life or below life or before life and not in life itself? So, being a product of the society, what's my first answer to that question? I became a total biology nut because I thought, well, they know the secret of life, right? And in high school, I went to Rockefeller Institute for the summer and the famous geneticist Objansky had the lab next to us, and we all the high school kids, we were thrilled. Anyhow, at some point, I realized, wait a second, to become a biologist, that's not the secret of life I was looking for. I wanted to know more about the meaning of life. And so, okay, my first point I'm going to make is about phenomenology, which is within philosophy, but is a kind of protest movement within philosophy. And that's the kind of philosophy I got drawn to. Um, because phenomenologists realized that for 2,500 years, philosophers were building these elaborate theories and these highfalutin concepts and these great structures, but they never really paid much attention to our actual lived experience. And so Edmund Husserl, around the turn of the century, said something which to most normal people on the street would sound crazy, but to philosophers, it was revolutionary. He said, let's go back to the things themselves, which sounds ridiculous if you're not a philosopher. I mean, what else is there except for the things themselves all around you and the people themselves all around you? But for philosophy, this was a big deal. And so I became a phenomenologist, which means that phenomenology assumes that reality is what we actually experience and that it's about describing our experience. But of course, let's go back to our town. There's a problem about that. Most people don't really pay attention to their experience. They don't even believe their experience. They believe what someone else tells them is the truth, what life is really about. So it's not so easy to actually describe your experience. Clifford Geertz in sociology, sort of the same time phenomenology was really picking up momentum, called it thick description. Not just to describe on the surface, but to keep trying to go deeper and really thickly describe, poetically describe, get to what's not just on the surface that we're all skidding along, but to get deeper. And so that's what phenomenology tries to do in a kind of straightforward explanation. So, okay, so Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty, is a friend, you all know, I'm all known on campus. I'm known in philosophy. I'm known everywhere as the guy who loves Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty, it was interesting, he was born in 1908 and he died in 1961 of a heart attack reading Descartes, which I'll explain in a minute why that makes sense. He was found slumped over a folio edition of Descartes in his office. But Merleau-Ponty was best buddies with two other famous philosophers, Jean-Paul Sartre, and his best friend, actually, and one of her best friends, Simone de Beauvoir. And when he really needed advice, when he really needed to talk to somebody, he would talk to Simone de Beauvoir, which is interesting if I had more time to talk about. Anyhow, Sartre, of course, became famous because what was his whole career about? Doom and gloom, alienation, violation. That really sells, Just check out the movie theaters and see how the horror films do versus the serious films. But Merleau-Ponty was kind of poo-pooed because he was giving us the good news. Merleau-Ponty was always about that you can find more meaning, you can create more meaning, there's always more to be discovered. And, that was seen as, who wants to hear that kind of good news? But Merleau-Ponty, I spent my life studying him because he's a very rich and imaginative philosopher who really took a path from, he actually had his first position as a child psychology professor and knew a lot of science, was an amazing polymath. He knew all this science, and he knew literature, but he became more and more interested in art and aesthetics, and his own writing became more and more poetic. And there's a reason why that happened, because he is the philosopher of the body. It's a kind of embarrassment to me as a philosopher that if you ask people about philosophy, what's the one thing they know? Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. um, and it's obviously, as a philosopher, I love to think, but thinking isn't all that I am, fortunately. Thinking isn't all that any of us are. And actually, I would say it's something that comes secondary to our embodied, fleshly, emotional, sensual, intuitive, imaginative enmeshment in the world. And that's what Merleau-Ponty was all about. Um, and part of his appeal for me was he took materiality seriously. I mean, so philosophy is known for what? Looking at the metaphysical side of existence, looking, that mind is what is most important. This invisible realm beyond the physical realm, that whether it's Plato's forms, whether it's certain forms of religious philosophy where God is totally beyond the material world, or whether it's even other forms of philosophy, that whether it's Kant's categories, it's all somehow disembodied, and not only disembodied, but immaterial. And Merleau-Ponty took materiality seriously. And I want to bring up a point about our culture in this following sense. We're a materialistic culture that I would say has no idea of materiality, because we gather up all these things and all these goodies and we possess them, but we don't really take them in fully. We don't take in the woodiness of wood or the flowingness of the river. We don't really perceive the things around us fully. And instead, we do what Merleau-Ponty called the experience error. We take all these intellectual categories and we slap them on what we actually perceive. So, like an example I use with my students is usually we're in one of these white painted rooms or sickly green rooms or whatever. And we look in the corner and I ask them what color it is, and they say white or green. But of course, if you're an artist, you realize, no, well, actually, there's all these shades of gray, all these shades of blue, all these different, maybe if it's sunny, shades of yellow, but that's an artist who really pays attention to their perception. And that's what Merleau and really therefore experiences materiality in its full richness. And so I think that's what Merleau-Ponty was trying to get people to do, to really experience the materiality around them. But also, okay, here's another problem with philosophy that Merleau-Ponty saw, is to split up mind. And I think I skipped this in my notes somewhere. That the whole history of our culture, not just philosophy, is made up of all these oppositions, right? All these dualities: mind versus body, self versus other, male versus female, reason versus emotion, nature versus culture. I mean, I could go on and on and on. And what I think Merleau-Ponty was trying to do was get beyond that. But in order to get beyond that, you have to see things dynamically in time. That if you take a snapshot of reality, yeah, things are broken up. And if you take a snapshot, things are isolated. Yes, I'm great friends with Libby now. Or I have this relationship with my wife, which is very wonderful and intimate. Or I can look down, see my sister, and see all these friends. But in the first instant, that was not true. It takes time. It takes a process. And our reality is that process. Our reality is how we synchronize with the world. So that's another aspect of kind of looking at the body the way that Merleau-Ponty did. It's not, philosophers, Edmund Husserl would say, there's a corpse body, which is a body as a thing, as an object. And then there's the living body, the life body, which is one which is dynamic and part of all these processes. And as part of all these processes, gets intertwined with all these other things in the world and also other people in the world. But not if you're going to constantly go like that, which is what philosophy's done, what Newtonian science did, what, so much of our analytical culture did. So he put things back into time. But, I think of John Barth a lot in a novel he wrote, Chimera, that the key to the treasure is the treasure itself. We're all, so much of philosophy is looking for this hidden key, and so much of what passes in all the disciplines is looking for this hidden key instead, looking below or above or beyond the world, instead of just believing in our experience and our embodied experience. But it requires a different kind of logic. So if we're going to get beyond all these binaries and see that things are interrelated, that all the people in this room have some kind of interrelationship, actually, that we're not totally isolated, even though on Zoom it's getting closer than than we used to be when we actually were face to face. That kind of logic, a lot of people are tempted then to say, like New Age philosophy, oh, we're all just one. Oh, we're all just, one in X. And, I can put it in a religious context. I can put it in a metaphysical context. I can put it in a New Age context. But Merleau-Ponty would say that's too easy too, because I am separate from you, from everybody here. But yet I'm not separate from you at the same time, And so it's a logic that the feminists also talked a lot about. It's a logic the Taoists talked a lot about. It's a logic the Buddhists talked a lot about, which is not one, not two. Doesn't fit our binary obsessed culture, which in the computer age is even worse, right? One or zero. But this is neither. It's neither, I am not you, but I'm not totally separate from you. I mean, Libby, Joan, Judith, Catherine and Jason, all these people are part of me and inseparable from me, and that they make up my life. And but yet I'm not them either. And so we have to think of this different logic of not one, not two. But another thing, and I'm trying to hit all my highlight ideas and very quickly. And this actually, okay. So when I first started studying philosophy, I remember my first professor at Yale looked at me in horror, and he said, "You're just a little walking Heidegger." Because my senior year in college, I'd become utterly fascinated with being in time, and with Martin Heidegger, who was, before Merleau-Ponty and kind of paved the way in certain ways for Merleau-Ponty. And his main concept was being in the world, that you can't take the person out of their world, historically, culturally, practically, like that, when Libby introduced me, you can't take me out of Marietta right now. Marietta's part of me. But also New York City, where I grew up, will always be part of me. That the person is part of a context. And actually, this goes back to the 19th century, to Jacob von Uxkall. And he did, he was one of the first really sensitive zoologists, animal scientists, who saw that about animals, that animals have what he called an Umwelt. You take a dog, you take a rat, you take a monkey, and you put them in a lab and you study them. You're not really seeing monkeys, rats, or dogs. You're seeing a creature that's been torn out of its environment and is not going to act the way it normally acts. It's not going to have the same capacities it normally has because it needs its environment. It's not separable from its environment. But what phenomenologists realized is that's one of our ties to the animals around us, that we're not really separate from our environment. I mean, other cultures are more sensitive to that than we are. The Native American culture is obviously very sensitive to that. A Poison Greater Than Love is a wonderful book about when the Ojibwa in Canada were moved by the Canadian government a couple hundred miles, they were destroyed. Or there's many books about the Great March out west, where again, the tribes were destroyed. But we're all destroyed in a certain way. We're displaced until we can gear into our environment again. We need to be part of our environment to fully have a sense of who we are and to fully be able to express ourselves. But for people who are kind of tuned out the way Thornton Wilder was talking in Our Town, they might not have that sensitivity to their environment. It's there, but they might be tuned out of it. And that becomes a dangerous situation, right? Because then you can do things to your environment that are really very detrimental to your own sense of yourself without even really realizing it, which is one of the ways that phenomenology and ecology intersect. So I'm sort of working towards a more radical idea, and I only have 5 minutes left, is that the world, in many, many, many cultures, it would be seen as common sense that the world speaks to us all the time. In our culture, that sounds like a radical idea. But one of the books I teach, I think I love this little anecdote. One of the books I teach, The Sacred Hoop by Paula Gunn Allen, and she's a Native American writer who, very wonderful writer. But you read a book by someone in our postmodern, Caucasian, capitalist, et cetera, culture, and who do they thank at the beginning of the book? They thank their publisher, they thank their editor, they thank their friends, they thank a bunch of people who are part of their success. Who does Paula Gunn Allen thank? She thanks the tumbleweeds. She thanks the sun. She thanks the mountains. She thanks all these parts of her environment because she said this book wouldn't be possible without those things speaking to her. Or Merleau-Ponty quotes many, many artists like Michelangelo who said, I don't just make a statue out of this block of marble. The block of marble tells me where what should be, chiseled out of it in order to make a statue. Or Valéry said, I don't write the poem. I listen to what the forests tell to me. And Merleau-Ponty has many, many artists who he quotes that way, that on a bodily, immediate level that we're so often tuned out of, the world speaks to us. He quotes Malraux, that the world speaks to us in voices of silence. It's obviously not talking, tree out there is not talking to me the way I'm talking to you, but it doesn't mean it's not somehow giving me some sense of its wavy gracefulness in the breeze right now. And we know that. We know if you're really hassled, go sit by the river and the river will calm you. And Merleau-Ponty called that idea reversibility, that we're in a dialogue with the world all the time, whether we're tuned out to that dialogue or not. The artists are, which is why he turned more and more to the artists as his career went on. And that means also, I only have 4 minutes and I'm not going to go over time, that one of his very first statements in the introduction to the phenomenology of perception, and excuse the language, it's 1945, there is no inner man, man is in the world. He's saying that this idea that there's an inner mystical self, he's disputing. He's saying what we are relational beings that are out in the world, as I see Catherine Keller in her first book was all about articulating this. That we're creatures that are part of this flow of sense and energy that spirals back and forth from the world, from other people, from other creatures, and back into ourself with each act of our perceptual feeling, sensing, emotional awareness, bodily intentions and gestures. So he called it part of the fabric of the world. But at the very end of his life, he had a very interesting idea. He gave up altogether the idea of the body. And what he talked about was human beings as part of the flesh of the world. And if you think about our flesh, it's made up of so many different kinds of beings, right? Whether you get to the cellular level where there's mitochondria and this kind of thing and that kind of thing, or whether you talk about the heart within the body or in the organs, whatever level you go to, the body is a community, and that's what we mean by talking about flesh. Well, he takes that and says that we ourselves are part of the flesh of the world, the way the world folds back on itself, that we sense because we're sensing because we're sensed. We're in this dialogue. We're part of this enmeshment. And that changes understanding. That comes to my friendship with Livy. That where you really understand then is in this embodied learning, on this level of immediate perception, immediate feeling, immediately communicating with the world. And, obviously for someone who's written 7 books, I like thinking, I like words, but the words have to be words that get us back to this felt experience. And that's why I've turned more and more to poetry, even as a philosopher, because poetic words are words that don't pretend to represent all the sense of the world. They're words that take you back to your perceptual, sensual, emotional, felt interaction with the world. They're kind of language that kicks you out of language and therefore allows language to say more than it normally does. The visible, the invisible meanings of the world, like love, like friendship, like loyalty, they're only expressed through the visible things, when the visible things are allowed to stretch beyond themselves. And that's why I've also gotten more and more into imagination. That, we think of imagination as fantasy, as make-believe, but actually it's part of our perception too. Coleridge, and Ed Casey taught me this 40 years ago. Coleridge, distinguished fancy, which he told writers, that's make-believe, that's this easier kind of imagination. If you want to be a good writer, avoid that. He said, get to this deeper creative imagination, which really takes our felt, lived experience and gets into the depths of it and breaks it open and brings it out for people in a way that you can't grab it, but you can see it out the corner of your eye. You can see it indirectly in between the lines of poetry. And we can express it. It's not like we can't express it. We can. We can I'm expressing it with my gestures, but you can gesture with language too, without trying to box everything in and capture everything. So poetry is that gesturing towards the world. But one of the last things I want to say, and then I'm going to stop in a minute, is when I talked about a moment ago, the flesh of the world, there's another ramification of that animals also are kin to us, and so is the natural world. Descartes was ridiculously, I don't even know what to say, arrogant in calling animals mere machines. And that was in the day in which they would dissect the animals without even anesthetic, because their groans and screams and cries were just machines making noise. Now we know that no, we haven't. Why is every single definition of human being got animal as part of it? The rational animal, the playful animal, the making animal, the imaginative man. It doesn't matter. Animal is always there and we don't pay attention to it. It's because we have this animal level of our body, this kinesthetic felt level that we really share with animals and other beings around us. So, okay, I'm not going to get to everything I wanted to say, but just going to look at one or two other things. So, finally, this really does rejoin science, because after Heisenberg, after modern science, there was a recognition that the observer and the observer intertwined. My friend Catherine's writing all about entanglements, which is even more a more intense connection, that even the material world, far apart from each other, further than could be explainable by the speed of light, you can change one electron, one chemical, and another one changes its ionization. You know, that there's an interconnectedness among all living beings and even non-living beings. And that means that, you know, we can't get outside to the God's eye view. I mean, I think we've realized that for a long time. We're not going to get to capital T truth. But it does mean that we can still try to get into as many of those places that are interrelating as possible. And philosophy just means it never comes to an end. And none of our inquiries come to an end. And that could be depressing or it can be exciting. Like there's always more. And that's actually Merleau-Ponty's final definition of reality. It's that which is inexhaustible. There's always more to uncover. So I'm going to finish my talk now. There's more I could say, but I'm not going to. Oh, I've got to say one more thing because of the virus, though. And all of this leads to embracing contingency. That we think, you know, these structures that we have set up have a necessity to them. They don't have a necessity to them in the way we think they do. They're human creations in a dialogue with the world that are always changing, and what philosophers call contingency, that it could be otherwise, it's not necessary, it's an accident of history and of the way things happened, is really being brought home to us right now by the COVID virus, right? We never imagined a world like we're living in right now. But for phenomenology, that's not a big surprise, but it means we have to somehow come to terms with it. And that's, Merleau-Ponty wrote this essay about adversity, and he said, all creativity really comes from adversity. And now I'm joining Jo Tyler, end of her talk too, that, you know, yes, we're in adversity right now in a very striking way, but that's a chance to create ourselves anew and to find our creativity in such a situation. So my answer to my own question, why be a body? It's to say yes to being in an indeterminate world, a world with inexhaustible meaning, where there's always more to express and to bring forth. And it also means, oops, I skipped my little political thing. It also means that no one has the absolute truth. No one is absolutely good either. Merleau-Ponty said there's no absolutely clean hands or dirty hands, that we do things and we help people, but at the same time it has unforeseen consequences and we hurt people. Like right now, we're helping people by isolating, we're saving lives, but we're hurting people who are, you know, near starvation. And that's how it is to be interrelated. It means to be as aware as you can of all the interrelations, all the relationships you have, because there's never going to be a purely good act that doesn't have ramifications. And so that's another thing you constantly have to be aware of. It's an endless task, which is either discouraging or exciting, that there's always more to do. So I'm going to conclude by reading the last line of my last book, and that's the end of my talk. So my last line of my last book is, we are enmeshed in an accessible common-rootedness in the depth of our planet's long history of sense, and its continual rebirth at each instant, such that there is a voice which comes from everything to which we are related to in our surroundings, a power to gesture that shows us a face, because everything has a face or an expression, with which we are able to express new meaning and new purpose together. Thank you. So, Ed, if you could all raise your hands, but I'm going to give Ed the first chance if I can find him. There he is. Okay, go ahead, Ed.
Glenn, wow, what an amazing talk. You said it all. you, you do what you're always so very good at. And that's what I first observed in you when I met you in the early 1970s. Glenn was my first dissertation student ever. And already with Glenn, I noticed what I would call a polymorphic creativity. He was not only doing good philosophy, he was writing poetry. He was living a life that was way beyond and way different from an academic life, as most people think of it. His theme today of animal is actually reminiscent of this fact that animal comes from animated, and animated comes from soul animation, soul vivification. And I think Glenn just gave us a beautiful embodied instance of animation at its best. Another aspect of Glenn's animation always was generosity of spirit. Always doing more, feeling more, being more than other philosophy grad students and philosophy teachers eventually, and now colleagues and friends. Glenn seems to have an unending reserve of openness to the world and embracing it, but in a very supportive and affirmative way, never chiseling a way, but actually affirming what seems right and good. And it usually is right and good. It's an uncanny sense. It's intuitive. It's a gift. It can't be put into so many words or concepts, but we really saw it today in Glenn's talk. It was embodied generosity of spirit, quite extraordinary. Between Glenn and myself, there always have been paradoxes. One of his very first books was on emotion. I'm writing a book now that may be my last book, and it's on emotion. So Glenn is always there first. He's a runner. He's way ahead of the game. He's certainly ahead of me, and I'm catching up with him even now. And another sense in which he outpaces me is here he is retiring at what I consider to be a young age. And here I am, his teacher. I'm now well over 80. I'm not even thinking about retiring. And so once more, Glenn beat me to it. He's ahead of the game. Let's put it that way. He's always been ahead of the game. I really want to honor in every way Glenn's creativity and magnanimity of spirit. It really goes beyond being a scholar of Merleau-Ponty. He really has brought Merleau-Ponty, or more exactly, the spirit of Merleau-Ponty, not the letter, but the spirit of the works of that French thinker to life in America, in American terms and local terms, and really brought philosophy home to roost in ways that we can all understand and relate to, which is a very great gift, rarely achieved in philosophy, when most teaching is really all about abstract consistencies and formal connections. Glenn really tries to bring it home, and he does so in the most vivid and remarkable ways. I think that his poetry is not a sideline, but is a main line of Glenn's life. As I say, he was already writing it in the 70s. He's still writing it. He's writing it well, movingly. Here, philosophy and poetry merge in the most extraordinary way, really a sacred marriage that I find unique and powerful and inspiring to all of us. So I just want to say to Glenn that you have been an amazing figure. You've inspired me and many others to live life more fully than we would ever have imagined it was possible. because you were doing it for us and with us. And we're still trying to catch up with you, Glenn. So here I give you my warmest greetings and a farewell into a new life that will, I'm sure, be just as creative and generous as your previous life in academia has been. So, my au revoir.
Thank you very much, Ed. I didn't realize that it was going to make such a speech like that. Sorry. I appreciate every word you said, Ed. Thank you. Are there questions that people want to ask or comments? Just raise your hand and I'll try to call on you. Troy, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So you have affected me like everyone else. You know, I too think that you've allowed all of us to see the world in a richer, deeper, more meaningful way. Turning to your talk, you mentioned a point that you emphasize often, which is Merleau-Ponty wants us to see our connectedness to the world. And it strikes me that one of the things that keeps us separated from the world is our hubris. And hubris actually, I think, grows out of the idea that we're somehow superior to other parts of the world, especially animals. I wonder, I'm just asking a question, I wonder what Merleau-Ponty has to say about hubris, if anything, and how we can get beyond it.
Thanks, Troy. Actually, so one of the pages I threw on the floor that I didn't get to was about doing away with hierarchies. You know, that I find in Merleau-Ponty, but, you know, I've written also, I find it in Taoism and Buddhism. And I was going to also quote a Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, because I think in Merleau-Ponty, I'm coming around backwards. I know I'm not starting with hubris. In Merleau-Ponty, I think there's this sense that everything in the world has intrinsic value, like Aldo Leopold was saying. Oops, am I still there?
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Somehow my computer's getting all these pop-ups at the moment. I'm trying to come back. But yeah, I'm back. Okay, so Aldo Leopold said that even, you know, like, for example, here's an example. You know, to me, when you see mountaintop mining, you know that that mountain had an intrinsic value as a being that influenced and meant so much to so many other beings, was part of this, what he called a biotic community. And I think Merleau-Ponty's writings and thought gives even more credence to what Aldo Leopold was trying to do as an ecologist, that everything as part of the flesh of the world has intrinsic value. And hubris, a hierarchy, to see ourselves as above just because we have certain capacities. I mean, there are capacities, so, okay, my little chihuahua is lying up against my hip here. I mean, my little chihuahua has capacities that I don't have. You know, she can hear, you know, far, far distant things that I can't hear. And, you know, why we insist that our capacities have to be on this hierarchy of intrinsic value. You know, many cultures would be totally perplexed by that, instead of seeing us as all part of it, what I'll again quote Leopold, as a biotic community, or a community that the Native Americans would say of 2 legs and 4 legs and all these other creatures and beings. So I mean, like hubris, Merleau-Ponty doesn't directly address it, but he is always addressing the sense that the ego self, which is so central to Western philosophy as well as culture, is a construction and a misapprehension insofar as we take it to be who I really am in my foundation and what's really valuable about me. Who I am, I mean, Merleau-Ponty as a child psychologist tried to show that we only become human through other humans by being talked into language, by being talked, by having the emotions of other people grab us up into this joint emotional life. So, I mean, he doesn't talk about hubris per se, but all of his writing is sort of undercutting it. Other comments, questions?
I want to say something.
Sure, go ahead.
First of all, I just want to thank you for like everything that you've taught me in the last 2 semesters that I've just been a part of your class. Before I was a part of your class, I was literally just going through the motions of life. I was a zombie. I was just walking around not knowing I was alive, and I was looking for answers. And then, you know, certain events transpired. I got into your class, started looking into the world more in depth, and you pretty much opened like a fountain of knowledge, and it just the fountain just keeps spraying higher and higher, and I just keep craving more and more, and I'm developing like my own outlook on life, and I just keep learning more and more every single day. And like one of my favorite things that you've ever like communicated to me was that outlook that will never have the God's eye view on the world that everyone seems to crave, seems to want. They want to find out the truth so badly, but I feel like once we find out that truth, it's all over. Like the fun it's not as fun anymore. And what I want to do is I just want to like experience this world for like everything it could just give to me, and then, you know, once this experience is over, find out what's next for me. And like for that, like you kind of woke me up, and now I talk to all my fans about it, and they look at me like, wow, man, you're so woke. And I'm just like, no, this knowledge has been out there forever. We just gotta look, you know, into it. I just got lucky, and now I am lucky enough to talk to people about it myself, and, you know, express my own emotions and my own feelings toward the world. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Hey, Hezekiah, it has been my honor and my pleasure to be your teacher this year. It's been so exciting to see you waking up and to see you growing. And, you know, that's true of so many of my students, but Hezekiah has just been a wonderful student this year, and it's been so exciting to watch him. So it goes both ways, you know. The teacher's always learning from the students and always getting re-energized from the students and inspired by the students. And you've been an inspiration to me this year, Hez.
Thank you, Professor. Send me poetry.
Okay, and I promise to listen to your music. Hez is a musician. Any other comments? Just go ahead. Holly.
I'm muted. Glenn, I would love to hear you say a little bit more about where you think we are right now. You ended with a little bit about, you know, this new COVID world that we've entered, but I've been thinking a lot about disconnection, new connection, unimagined connection, and what's happening in the world as it is. And I feel like I would just love to hear what you think is happening to us right now as bodies, and connected and disconnected bodies, and where you might think we're going.
Like Joe's talk. So when you said that, maybe it's because I'm looking at all these old faces of people I've known for decades. It made me think of that first semester when I was so fascinated with Heidegger, because Heidegger has this thing about a hammer, and he says, you know, everything in the world around us, we never really notice it till it breaks, and then all of a sudden we really notice it. And I think, you know, that's true of COVID. What COVID, I mean, I'm going to look on the positive side as I always do. You know, that right now, the fact that we're separated, we can't be fully separated. Even, you know, even just being on the screen together, there's some sense of community, some sense of interconnection. Because like people talk of out of body experiences, I would say they're not out of body, they're extended body. Our body extends everywhere. and into everyone else and into everything else. And so COVID has sort of broken our immediate ability to connect face to face, but it can't. In some ways, it's bringing out more connection. In Pennsylvania at 7 o'clock this Sunday, every person is being asked to ring bells for 3 minutes to celebrate someone like, right below me, Jill Kennedy, who's a respiratory therapist on the front lines, to celebrate our community, how people are sacrificing for us. And so, in some ways, we're being more connected through this breaking in our connection. And what I would hope for the future is that it makes us appreciate and aware of things that we become blind to and so routinized that, people drive to work and they're their coworkers, and they don't really take into account how great it is to have these people there, and the person in the next cubicle who they haven't talked to for the last 2 years or whatever. I'm hoping that by breaking our normal everyday life, that we come to appreciate all these things in a way that we'd become, blind. My first book was about emotional blind numbness. We'd become emotionally blind and numb to. So it's an opportunity. Yeah, we can abuse, everything like this is, the Chinese character for crisis, which is, also an opportunity. It can either go in either direction. We can use it creatively and see our interconnectedness and how vital it is and how rich the face-to-face is and how much being with a group of other people means to us. Or, we can just go back to sleep, and I hope we don't do that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other, I know we're going to be overtime, but any other comments from anybody or questions? Yes, go ahead. Sean, good to see you, Sean.
It's great to see you, Dr. Mazis. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Mazis, and congratulations. I took your course, Philosophy of Imagination and Memory, and it was probably, I think, it was just an amazing course, probably the best course I ever had. And I'm halfway through your final book here, and I just need to pick it up again. But I'm right where, I heard a lot of people talking about the connectedness, and I'm feeling that pilot that you talk about in Saint-Exupéry, I think is how you pronounce it. And I just love that excerpt. And it speaks a lot. It's like Merleau-Ponty speaks a lot about. Sounds like it sounds a lot to me. I guess I don't know, like about self-sacrifice to a certain degree. But I love how you you focus, because I was always interested in like the doom and gloom and the existential aspects of things. But you really turned me on to Merleau-Ponty's looking at the the better, the more positive, the positivity in it. And I think that is something that by and large our culture needs to embrace more, especially now. And not the not the doom and the gloom, because that's what sells. I worked in the news industry for a little while, and I know that's what it sells, but finding the connectedness and the brighter side, and for more, lack of a better word, but it was great hearing your commentary, and thank you very much.
Those are great comments, and they allow me to say something I wanted to say that, again, I just didn't get to. So like this polarization in our country, it's just another dualism, right? And it's so easy when you are disembodied and sort of taking these abstract positions versus really being in the face-to-face contact with another person. And, or in the book where Sean's referring to, Saint-Exupéry, is a famous pilot, and he volunteers 5 or 6 times to fly missions when France is is overrun by the Germans, and they won't let him do it. But finally, he writes to Eisenhower, and he's given permission. And he's flying these missions, and the Germans are overrunning France, and it's just a slaughter. And 99% of the people aren't coming back from these missions. They're suicide missions. But he's flying over these people, and he sees the ants fleeing from the Germans, and he feels no connection to them. And he's wondering, like, I'm doing this ethical thing. I'm defending my country. I'm fighting against, aggression. He has all these ethical reasons, but he feels totally empty, like he's just going through the motions. And then he flies over Arras, which is the French title of the book, and they take this heavy artillery fire into the plane, and the people on the plane don't know that they've got these experimental gas tanks. Just like our tires nowadays, if you run over a nail, it kind of absorbs it without you getting a flat. Well, that's the kind of gas tank they have. And they take all this fire and they think, we're dead, forget it. But it turns out that the gas tank absorbs the fire and they get back to base. And facing death that way, all of a sudden, he's a different person. He looks around at the guys he's been flying with, and he takes them in and feels this connection with them. And he goes back to the farmer's family that's putting him up, and he feels like the bread they're sharing is sacred, and he sees their kindness, and he's back on this emotional embodied level with them. And then all of a sudden, the ethical stuff means a lot more to him. Now he flies over people and he feels totally connected to them and their fear and their courage. And then all of a sudden the ethics means more to him, the rules that he's learned as a kid or in church or whatever. And that's what I'm trying to say in that book, that if we have that felt solidarity, that has to underlie our principles and our ethics. Otherwise, they just become empty. We need that immediate connection. And that's what we're, being deprived of right now. But we still have some connection, even in these mediated ways. But I hope that we really come to cherish, to come back to Holly's question after this is over.
So, Glenn, I just want to say that this was just an absolute pleasure. The talk itself was an absolute pleasure. I am so thankful that back in 2002 or 2003, when I gave that talk, when Bill Maher was there, that you encouraged me to be bolder. So I really want to thank you for living your life in such a way that there doesn't seem to be a separation between the personal and the political, and between the personal and the academic. You have always been totally who you are and have been such an inspiration for me. And I know that this is your, quote, last lecture as an unretired faculty member at Penn State, but it is certainly not your last lecture, nor is it your last interaction with me. So let's unmute yourselves and give Dr. Glenn Mazis, professor, not professor emeritus, but yet for another week. For now, he's distinguished professor of philosophy and humanities. So let's give him a big woo-hoo. All right, Glenn.
Hey, Glenn.
Right.
Thank you all. Judith just brought in this lilac bush that was lilacs from the lilac bush. It was given to us by Bruce and Donna Wilshire. Bruce Wilshire was a magnificent philosopher, and I owe a lot to him. He was a friend and a father figure to me.
I have a picture. They had a picture.
I want to thank Bruce. Thank you all. I really appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Best wishes.
Thank you.